Welcome to Tech Tuesday. My name is Abbie Ritchie. I am the founder and CEO of Senior Savvy, and you can find me here every Tuesday interviewing people who are involved in the age tech space. I have a wonderful guest joining us today, but first, let's go ahead and get started. I want to invite on to Tech Tuesday this week, Richard Carroll. Dr. Carroll, welcome to Tech Tuesday.
Thanks, Abbie. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, if you are not familiar with Dr. Caro, he has over 30 years of experience truly working at the intersection of technology and business. He's worked at startups. He's started some companies of his own. He's a scientist and inventor, an angel investor, and an advisor to emerging growth companies. He truly has a deep expertise in the fields of age tech, medical devices, healthcare, digital health, telecom, as well as other photonics, which you'll have to tell me a little bit more about that. He is the co-founder of the Tech Enhanced Life. And I'm thrilled to have him with us today to talk about the Tech Enhanced Life, how it benefits residents, and how it can be used to also support senior living communities. Welcome.
Thanks, Abbie.
Yeah, so tell us, what are some things that you're involved in right now that are supporting senior living communities?
Well, there's a few different things. Let me just mention two of them that I think are probably most interesting to people listening. First of all, we have this community of older adults called the Longevity Explorers. It's a club, really, of older adults ranging from people in their 60s all the way through to a few over 100, which is kind of interesting. And they meet regularly to explore new products, new ideas, kind of at the intersection of aging and technology originally, but more broadly than that. And it's really a fun group to be part of. As I said, we think of it as a club. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is an outgrowth of that is our community, these explorers, has started to evaluate products and write up reviews about them on the Tech Enhanced Life website. And we've been doing that for years now. And so there's a deep repository of information about which products work for specific problems, what types of people benefit from different products and things like that. So I think those two things, the community of explorers, which is older adults actually testing things for themselves, and the kind of results which we write up on Tech Enhanced Life, those are probably the two things that I'm most excited about.
I'd actually like to join the explorers. I'm very, very involved and interested in trying out products that are going to benefit the lives of the people I work with. And so could I join?
You could.
I could. Okay, good. And so tell me, what are some of the products that you've recently explored and you've written up that you think are more people need to hear about?
You know, there's a broad range. On one extreme are things like, the Apple Watch, which has fall detection included, and maybe we can talk more about why that's particularly interesting. So that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is products that almost no one has heard of, particularly relating to the area that we think of as smart home features,
Yeah.
where, the place where you live can become a bit intelligent and do some things for you. And we're finding various small companies making interesting new widgets that no one's heard of, which by themselves have limited value. But when you start to put them all together in a solution, we've got some pretty interesting things there we've come across.
Let's talk about those, because in research I've been doing recently, I've been looking at different products that have sensors in them, whether it's for fall or for habits or just for patterns and detection that different sensors can pick up on to allow other people to know if everything is okay, not in a spy, creepy kind of way, but in a way that can detect anything that's not on the surface.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting space. You know, when we first got into this, I and a geriatric care manager wrote a book, an ebook actually, about that exact category of products back in 2014 when they were starting to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And I continue to think they're very interesting. The truth is, they haven't really taken off. And we can talk about why that is. But
Yeah,
I agree with
what's
you that
that? Why do you think they haven't really taken off? Do you think there's too much? There's a stigma around it?
I think there's quite a few reasons. The first one is that the average older adult probably doesn't even know they exist. That's the
Mhm.
first problem. The second problem is that the products themselves have often been implemented in a way that's a bit limiting. So in particular, the algorithms that look at what all those sensors are seeing have been fairly simplistic. You really need a person at the other end to be watching the screen and see what happens. You know, it doesn't kind of synthesize it, and that's an issue of just the products being at an early stage. And then the third issue is that you picked an area which is what I think of as kind of safety.
Mm.
And there's a school of thought among entrepreneurs and the aging services industry that safety is what people care about. Whereas what we found is that safety is certainly important, but it may not be the number one priority of your typical older adult. So by picking that as the focus, it's maybe not the most interesting product category to older adults themselves.
What is then, if safety is not what is?
I think it varies depending on the person.
Mhm.
So people who have physical impairments or cognitive impairments, compensating for those is pretty important. Um, but I pull back and I think quality of life and autonomy are two things that people really care a lot about. And so I wouldn't say safety is unimportant, but I think people maybe care more about quality of life and particularly autonomy.
Okay, so let's go back to these products then. If these products can bring a quality of life or an autonomy and allow someone to be more independent longer, would that be a stronger angle?
I think so. Or at any rate, an angle that I think might resonate more. Let me give you a specific example.
Okay.
So I was having a conversation on a completely different context with an adult child of an older adult, right? So someone probably in her 50s and her parents were in their 80s. Um, and she was telling me about her mother who lived by herself and had some significant physical difficulties. And she explained to me that her mother had a caregiver that came every day to help her cook the lunch and, make the bed and various things like that. And that what would happen in the past was that when the caregiver left at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she would pull the shades down, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and so after that, after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the older adult would be sitting there with no sunlight. And so the daughter discovered some smart home solutions that could pull the shades up and down at a voice command.
Mhm.
And so now her mother can say, pull the shades, lower the shades. The caregiver no longer has to put her in the darkness, at 3 o'clock. The mother now has control of her own ability to pull the shades up and down. So I think that's a really interesting example where first you're replacing a rare, the scarce resource of the caregiver doing things. And second of all, you're restoring autonomy to the older adult. I think those sort of things can have a big impact.
Let's apply it to a senior living community. So if this would help an operator, if this would help a senior living community to have more smart home features built in, what would that look like?
Well, it would depend a bit on the goals of the senior living facility.
Mhm.
But if the goals were to maximize the quality of life of the older adult, then you could just continue to build on that example I just gave you, right? So if the person needs help pulling down the shades, turning on the lights, instead of waiting for the employee of the senior living facility to come by and knock on the door to do that, they could do it for themselves. And in fact, we have some of our longevity explorer circles in senior living communities. And quite a few years ago now, when Alexa first came out, perhaps we'll talk about that too. One of the things that the members of our explorer group in senior living facilities were very excited about was exactly this ability either to have the shades automated or have the lights get turned off. So now when they go to bed, they can have the light turned on and off, things like that. Yeah. At the moment, we're just talking about, fairly simple physical things where you talk to the room and it does stuff for you. But then there are other things you can imagine in a senior living community. For example, most of them have some way of kind of checking in on the residents daily to make sure there's nothing bad happened. Mm-hmm. And often that involves a human having to do something. Mm-hmm. But it wouldn't need to. For example, those sensors you talked about before can do that quite well. And so the senior living facility can replace the need for a person to walk up and down the corridor checking whether the little light has gone off when they press the button or not, with a sensor.
Right? Or someone having to make a phone call.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to make a note of this. It was like this monitoring aspect, because I know a lot of these products, whether it's Apple Watch and it tracking your gait, for instance, or it's something else that's a sensor that is noticing a change in your voice or even in your temperature. A lot of these products, they have the technology in them, but where does the data go to, right? And who is monitoring this? Because it's only as good as the person who's receiving it on the other end and doing something with it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the issues, really. Yeah. I remember when we were writing our book about these products, I was talking to one of the people who deployed it for their parents. This was in a home rather than in a senior living facility, but the idea is the same. And so I talked to maybe 10 or 20 people who deployed these, and these were the adult children, right? They were kind of typically the person who was initiating this. Yeah. And one of them said, I love this so much because I have this screen in my office, and all day while I'm working on my emails, I look at whether my mother just went to the bathroom or whether she just went to the fridge or whatever. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what his mother thinks of that. So that was one example of what happens. You have this engaged person actually watching.
Right.
But then I talk to some other people and they go, well, I've got a job. I don't have time to be staring at the screen all day to see if my mother just went to the fridge. So I think the opportunity is for the products to have some artificial intelligence built into them that looks at all that and synthesizes it and only tells you when there's a problem. And some of the companies have tried to do that, but they're a bit rudimentary, so they're not really sophisticated enough yet.
Right. They need to be tracking habits and patterns, right?
They do. Mm-hmm.
Habits and patterns.
And, some of the newer products do try and do that. And some people have been quite pleased with the results. So I think it's getting there.
Mm-hmm. And if this is something that can be implemented in a community, for instance, these habits and patterns, and in such a large community, also with a large population of people, I think this is one of those things that could really benefit communities in terms of the workforce, for sure.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. It can also benefit in terms of theoretically. I mean, one of the things that I think really needs to exist and doesn't quite exist yet is some ability to monitor the potential for falls. There's lots of things that detect when a fall happens, and there are starting to be some products that try and predict whether you're going to fall or not. But again, they've got a long way to go, I think. And I think that's an area that's pretty interesting, sort of the check engine light, either for falls or cognition or a few other areas.
Let's talk about those, because I think that's one way that that a lot of hospitalizations can be prevented as well as deaths. And so what are some products that you can recommend, that you can talk about, that would support fall prevention?
There's a couple that have come to market for the senior living industry that try and do what I just said. They try and, measure gait and produce a risk score.
Mhm.
We haven't tried out we haven't tried them all out, so I'm reluctant to call out any specific companies. I think the potential is huge. My impression is that they haven't quite mastered the whole thing. It's got to be more than just detecting gait. In my opinion, you have to monitor gait and produce a risk score and then intervene to improve it. So it's got to be that kind of complete closed loop. I haven't seen anything that does all of that yet, although perhaps there's something I'm not aware of. But I think that's where it's going, and I think that would be really great.
Yeah, I've seen some data for e-relators that are able to do that pretty well, but I don't know if they're out there just yet
Also,
either.
I'm not sure they close the loop and work on improving the score.
You mean by being able to provide more stability and distance or exercise or something like that?
Um, Something like that, yes. I mean,
Like,
exactly how, that's
like
the
with
missing
PT?
piece.
Yeah,
But
like
for example, a PT program
yeah,
specially designed to improve your balance or something like that.
okay. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I have heard of that. That's really good. You mentioned earlier the use of Alexa for some of those smart home devices.
hmm
And do you feel like Alexa more and more is going to be able to close the gap with being able to use those type of skills?
Well, it's got great potential. Whether it succeeds or not depends a bit on what the company decides to do, right? But what I think is interesting to think about is, first, the whole idea of being able to talk to something instead of having to use your keyboard. I think that is a big advance in terms of, it eliminates the problems with swiping and pressing and tremor and all sorts of other things. So I think that's great. Then the question is, what's it actually do? And we talked a bit about the idea of having it, turn on lights and all that. So that's, I think, simplistic examples. I think what's interesting as well is explored Alexa first, probably back in 2017 now. What our explorers opinions vary. Some people like it, some people don't, right? It's not a perfect product. But of the people who like it, um, some of them say things like, well, Alexa is my friend.
Yeah.
And so there's this whole idea of, the social interaction with an artificial intelligence. And we're focusing on Alexa, which is one product made by one company, and there are competitors, right? So as we talk about this, we probably should talk about voice activated interfaces, of which that's just one company.
Mhm.
Um, but so social interactions, I think, is kind of intriguing.
Yes, I do too. And in my research, I also find that older adults eventually begin to look at the assistant as it's like a domestic assistant. So it goes from being a digital assistant to a domestic assistant to a personalized friend that tracks your moods. It tracks how you were feeling yesterday, and if you're feeling any better today. It turns on when you come into the room. It tracks your habits. It knows what your abilities are like. And that is a relationship that begins to adapt over time. And I think that's really going to be able to fill the gap in a lot of senior living communities.
Maybe, I'm not sure it does all those things just yet,
Uh-huh.
but I totally agree with you that maybe it could,
Yeah.
which I think is really intriguing. It also, it does raise the question of where all that information goes, doesn't it? So
Yes.
the
Yeah.
people who don't like these products worry a lot about the privacy and Big Brother and all that stuff. So I think that's pretty important to address.
You mentioned a little while ago about an adult child being able to watch his mom or watch their mother on the screen. But there are other products, I know I've seen them, that are more sensor related. Like you cannot exactly see what the exact behavior is, but you can tell what the routine or the pattern is, right?
Yeah, actually, when I said watch, I didn't mean a camera type thing. Most of the companies have decided that's a bad approach, but a lot of the sensors will tell you whether the older adult just opened the fridge, as a simplistic example, right? And when I said watch, I meant that you could see that the sensor said, okay, she just opened the fridge. But I think you're right that that's not terribly useful if that's all it does, because what you need is some artificial intelligence that's noticing that she just went to the fridge and then comparing it with how many times she did that yesterday. And instead of presenting all that raw information, it's synthesizing it to say, you know what, something really big just changed between what she's been doing for the last 6 months and what she just did in the last 2 days. You might want to give her a call, stuff like that.
Right. Like she didn't get up, or um, or
Yeah.
she's down, for instance.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So, I wanted to also ask you about monitoring, about the pendant monitoring. And, I've done some research for clients in the past where you get to a place where, and even in senior living, they have pendant monitoring, and they're requiring residents to wear them. How do you feel about pendant monitoring?
Well, that's a large topic. So when you say pendant monitoring, that might mean a few different things. Let's just unpack that.
Okay.
So the typical product that people wear around their neck is mostly supposed to be a fall detector, right? Or a call for help button sort of thing. And the fundamental idea is that if something bad happens, you can press the button and get help. Or with the more intelligent ones, it notices that you fell over, and even if you're sort of unconscious because you hit your head, it will summon help. So that's the first layer of usefulness of those products. Then in addition, some of them, especially in senior living facilities, will know exactly where the person is at any moment of time and send a signal back to some central monitoring place that will say resident number 236 is right now on the bowling green or something like that. And that's the tracking. So I'm not quite sure which one you were talking about there. But they both have pluses and minuses. The plus is that if something bad happens, you can get help. I guess the bad bit is someone knows a lot about you.
Yeah.
And so I think it's like a lot of these products, it's a question of weighing the benefits and the negatives. So for some people at some stages of their life, that ability to get help quickly is definitely worth whatever the negative is. And for other people, perhaps it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, I see a lot of stigma around wearing them, and
Definitely.
that's what I see. Whereas with the watch, I don't see that same amount of stigma. So and
Can
uh,
I riff on that for a sec?
sure, go for it.
So I totally agree with you. The pendants, I mean, my classic quote was one of our explorers said, I have one. I mostly keep it in my bedside table because it makes me look like I escaped from the hospital. And I don't really want to look like I escaped
Yeah.
from the hospital. And if you think about those pendants, they're mostly designed to be, well, they're usually quite large, which is an unavoidable aspect of what they have to do. But they always have flashing lights and things like that. They're not at all unobtrusive. And so I think one of the most interesting trends that I wanted to be sure to mention is we see this kind of convergence of consumer electronics and age tech a little bit, with
Mhm.
the Apple Watch being a classic example, because they've taken a product that is really a sort of aspirational device, something you want to have rather than something you have to have. And
Mhm.
they've incorporated some of the features of those pendants that you talked about into them. And so now you can have something you'd actually like a fancy watch that 20-year-olds want too, and it includes some of the features of the pendants. I do want to say it doesn't quite include all of the features of the pendant, so it hasn't yet become like a no-brainer that you want the watch instead of the pendant. But it's a trend that I think is really important because it removes that stigma, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, and if you are wearing it, sometimes that's all you have to do, right? And it doesn't do you any good if you're leaving it in your bedside drawer, right?
Totally.
Totally.
Yes. So when we've actually done a lot of research on all these different products. We're talking about these call for help type things. There's a lot on our website, but when you get into comparing the perfection of one pendant versus the other versus the watch, there's a lot to be said about that. But actually, probably the most important question is, will someone wear it?
Yep.
So it's better to wear a not quite perfect product than to have a perfect product in your bedside table.
Yep, absolutely. What other things do you think would be really helpful for senior living operators that to include in their communities at this point?
I think that we're in a stage where there's huge potential, but we're lacking the actual products. So you can talk a lot about things that should exist that would be kind of useful. It's harder to talk about things that actually exist. And also, I don't really want to sound like an infomercial, but in terms of things that could exist, I think that there's two really interesting areas that I would focus on if I was in the senior living industry. The first one, of course, that's on everyone's mind is the labor issues. There's labor shortages. They're going to get worse. Everyone agrees on that. And senior living is a very labor intensive industry, the way it's structured at the moment. And so I think the potential of artificial intelligence and robotic things interpreted in a much more sophisticated way than humanoid robots walking around doing things for you. I think the idea that artificial intelligence and robotics can augment existing human caregivers, not replace them, but augment them, do things that maybe you don't really need a human to do. I think that's very important. Actually, my second area has escaped me for the second. I'll come back to it probably.
Yeah, when you were just talking about the robot, I think in terms of deliveries that they would be super helpful.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Getting your groceries, sending the glass of water around the corridor or something like that.
Yep.
I just thought of what my second area was. Sorry, I forgot. But so I think independence and autonomy, they're not a big feature of senior living at the moment at all. But if one's goal is to attract more older adults to want to be in senior living, I personally think independence and autonomy is the missing piece for many people. And I think that some of these new products do help with that a bit, because if you can do things for yourself using some of these gadgets instead of always having to call the friendly employee of the senior living, I think that kind of makes a big difference to one's life.
Okay, that brings up a really good point. So there are some things such as Cubigo, for instance, which is a resident engagement platform that has a built-in lift or built-in car concierge in it. And anytime that you can do that rather than relying on the built-in concierge service at a community, that's one extra layer of independence, right?
Totally.
Okay, good. So I like that feature because it gives the resident the opportunity to schedule their own rides independently based on the technology that the community is giving them.
Yes. And you mentioned a specific product that's kind of an interface between these ride sharing services and the older adult, which is fine. But of course, the older adults can also use the apps themselves, like Lyft or Uber or whatever. I mean, not all of them can, but many of them can. And we've found that this ability to get where you want to go when you want, rather than to have to wait for the friendly social worker to put you on the bus that only goes to certain stops, that's really empowering. I think that's very important.
I do too. I know that there are other resident engagement platforms like Touchdown, for instance, that has an integration with Opentable. And so anytime that a resident's able to create a reservation through Touchdown using Opentable, it's one less step that removes the workforce from having to do that for them and continues to allow them to be independent. So yeah, I'm seeing more and more of these third-party integrations built into engagement platforms that I think have become really helpful for a lot of residents.
I think that's good. Yeah, I agree with you. But actually, I think that what's even more important is to facilitate the residents learning how to use a smartphone, because some of them can't, of course, but many of them can. And it's really more of an educational thing. Perhaps they need your help more. But um, we found in our explorer circles in senior living facilities that lots of them can use smartphones, and
Mhm.
if taught properly, they can use Lyft and Uber and grocery delivery if they want it, or all these different services. And so rather than saying, well, everything has to be somehow through some monolithic integrated resident service, why not just help them do things for themselves?
Yeah, well, that's what Senior Savvy works on, and truly on the basics, because we found that when you understand the basics, you feel empowered and encouraged to continue learning independently. And so that's really the paradigm that we work within. And I think that a lot of other communities are getting more and more on board with that process as well.
That's good, isn't it? Yes, I think it's super important.
Yeah, well, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm fascinated. I want to join your explorers group. I want to be an explorer right there with your group. And if anyone else is interested in finding out more about what you're involved in, where's the best place for them to reach you?
So our website, which is at www.techenhancedlife.com, is where we put all the stuff we research, and where you can sign up to be a longevity explorer, and where we explain more about why we do all this and all that stuff. So techenhancedlife.com is the place to go.
Wonderful. And if you have any questions, feel free to write into us. We'll be sure to get back to you, and we will post the broadcasts of this later on today. And for those of you, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you back here next week.